And we are live, broadcasting from the great ether/internet. Welcome to Poets House live streaming. Poets House is with you in solidarity. My name is Paulo Javier, and I am a poet and program director of the organization, our nation's poetry library with an open stack featuring over 70,000 volumes that welcomes everyone to read and be inspired by poetry. Even though Poets House is closed to the public, Poets House continues to find ways to share the resources of our library and programming online to invite everyone into the transformative power of poetry. I offer my respect to Lenape people and to their continuing presence in their homeland and throughout the diaspora. I offer my reverence. Tonight's broadcast is one of the ways that we aim to support the poetic voice that is deep within us all. We are so honored to welcome poets Ed Roberson, Joan Kane, and Brian Teare for a reading and a conversation about life and justice in the Anthropocene, the human epoch. Each poet will be presenting work that considers the role of poetry alongside pedagogy and protest in the global movement for climate action. Tonight's broadcast is also presented as part of I Am Deliberate and Afraid of Nothing, which is a quote from the great Audre Lorde. Poetry and protest is the theme of this year's fourth annual initiative of the Poetry Coalition, an alliance of more than 25 organizations dedicated to working together to promote the value poets bring to our culture. Without further ado, I am so honored, excited, giddy to be welcoming our first presenter, Brian Teare, to our event tonight. Brian is a former Pew Fellow in the Arts and the recipient of poetry fellowships from the NEA, the MacDowell Colony, the American Antiquarian Society, the Fund for Poetry, the Vermont Studio Center, and the Headland Center for the Arts. Brian is the author most recently of Doomsday Days, which won the T.S. Eliot Four Quartets Prize for the serial poem. Brian, I'm so thrilled to be welcoming you to tonight's program, and I look forward to your talk.
Thank you so much, Paulo. I am really honored to be here with Joan and Ed, who are two of the poets who I think of as tutors to my own practice. I am going to give a talk called Thread, Nest, Stem, Forms of Precarity. I left the path and walked into the pines, a plantation planting, all the trees the same age, the same distance apart, their trunks the same diameter. No underbrush, I walked into the beauty of rational symmetry, my field of vision divided. The bare brown rough bark evenly lifting itself out of a soft mat of rust-colored needles. Always an awareness of the dark green canopy above, the wind sifting distant branches into loud, louder, loudest. Then just ahead, 10 to 15 feet up, pale violet yarn wound around the trunks and stringing them together, creating a kind of web or network in the air. I felt instantly that someone had invited the root system of the pines above ground, given its symbiotic network of roots and fungi an aerial home, and that somehow I also stood on the underside of the mat of needles that covered the ground and could see through the dirt as though it were air. It was a wonderful, vertiginous feeling full of awe and confusion, my perception of the real wavering in indecision in a delicate, pleasurable way. After my vision figured out how to hold the marvelous, I saw that the web was not entirely intact. There, among the many pale violet threads, ran a darker counterpoint of pine green ones, most of which had broken and begun to unravel from their trunks. Even the marvelous is subject to weather and the law of entropy, and back to the path I walked, full of this delicate pleasure, the feeling I'd chanced upon a transit into the visionary and seen reality's secret other side exposed. Back on the path to the actual, it was the MacDowell Colony in 2005. This summer, I'd begun to write the poems that would become companion grasses. Cecilia Vicuna's poetry had long been important to me. It had shown me that etymological root work could reveal a kind of cultural commons, a shared linguistic history undergirding the surface work of both semantic meaning and ecological thought, a revelation meaningfully extending and radicalizing Emerson's arguable claim that every word which is used to express a moral or intellectual fact, if traced to its root, is found to be borrowed from some material appearance. It wasn't until that day among the pines that I'd encountered her sculpture, most of which is built to be precarious. And to be precarious in Vicuna's poetics is to be small, fragile, contingent, made of scavenged materials, and also prayerful. Prayer from precaria, which is an entreaty, both a petition to a higher principle and an admission of need. Precarity is the shared condition, her work argues, that binds all beings together, and her work assumes that, quote, the word is the breath of love armed to inspire love for the great poem creation, unquote. But her work also acknowledges that democracy, rooted in the demos, comes from the root die, to divide, and that democracy contains within it division of society, demos, people, land. As in the forest whose pale frayed thread network lifted my vision upward to find both our interconnectedness and our brokenness made numinous, Vicuna's poetics links visible systems with what lies underground, our common root in creation, the having been brought into existence that everything on earth has experienced. My encounter with Vicuna's visionary web galvanized my sense in 2005 that I wanted to make poems that could account for both interconnectedness and division, thread, and the duress that snaps it in an instant. The poems I wrote that summer were all experiments in how poetic form might embody ecological and existential precarity, which, because of its root in prayer, is inherently a metaphysical situation as well, the fragment, a possible transit between the actual and the visionary. The poems I wrote then suppose the postmodern fragment as a kind of metonymy, a way to acknowledge the partiality of human ecological experience, meaning both that we are at home without fully knowing it, and our experience of Earth's ecosystems is so limited. Inspired by Anne Lauterbach's notion of the whole fragment, I thought then of the ecological fragment as gesturing toward an intuited but unexperienceable whole, meaning my own place in ecological relation. The sentence breaks, I wrote that summer, to let in the there. I liked how the complete incompleteness of the fragment invited otherness into the poem, or at least left room for it, so that more meaning than I intended could inhabit it, the way birds will nest in the cavity of a living tree and make the life inside it multiple. This sense of fragment rhymes with the recent work of poet and visual artist Danielle Vogel, whose ceramic sculptures and poems constitute an extended meditation on nesting as both act of creation and as a mode of dwelling in language and flesh. Vogel shares with Vicuna a faith in the precarious. Their bodies of work gesture toward what Vogel calls the ethereal impulse of an entirety, intuited from fragments. If for Vicuna the thread is a central metaphor, thread as rootlet, as web of life, as menstrual flow, as a medium for continuing and counting and binding, for Vogel the nest is central, composed as it is of the minuscule that haunts toward the whole. Like a poem, a nest can be woven or felted, threaded together or collaged, and most importantly, perhaps, its form registers everywhere the body that made it, whether it pushed fresh mud into a cupped shape or tamped moss and down into a soft fabric that lines a weave of twigs and plastic trash. For Vogel, a seemingly self-contained word reaches out and elicits the tension between folds, gravity, and collapse. And like Vicuna's precarios, Vogel's nests began when poetry became a kind of prayer, precarious acts that acknowledge the fragility and need of having been created, as well as the ingenuity necessitated by our shared condition. At root, Vicuna reminds us the demos is divided, which is why it matters that she's a Chilean woman and that her work originated in the context of a dictatorship and draws upon the imperiled indigenous traditions of her home country. It matters that Vogel is a lesbian and that her work derives its interrogation of embodiment, form, and creation from a gendered queer physicality that is made through the muscle and synapse fields of each syllable. In the years following 2005, I ventured deeper into relation with the fragment and began to see it as a response not just to our partial experience of our place in ecology, and not just as an acknowledgement of being's essential precarity, but also as a linguistic form that can weather, endure, and capture uncertainty, doubt, injustice, and violence. During those years, the stem was my central metaphor. I was making language a stem to aspire to, I wrote in 2007. Durable, flexible, able to register shift quickly, when shaken, to keep shape. The stem is, of course, a grassy fragment. Beneath it, roots. Above it, inflorescences. From it, leaves. And if I was most obviously in love with florere, its sexual flowering, the poems of companion grasses acknowledge the crucial work of endurance stems do by supporting the engendering work of reseeding. But in those years, I found it difficult to situate those stems in the field of the demos, the socio-political and economic systems that have divided the land and the people and have created climate crisis. Though toward the end of composing the book, I'd figured out some provisional ways to do so. Riding companion grasses and doomstead days on foot eventually led me to turn my focus away from individual stems and flowers toward the field itself. And as I began to contextualize my en plein air writing practice with research, I also began to situate the plants I love in history: settler colonialism, urban development, endless war, the petrochemical industry, each a crucial episteme of the Anthropocene. Still rooted in the precarity of the ecological fragment, my writing practice developed a narrative aspect derived from site specificity and a collage process not unlike the felting of a nest. The stems and flowers of my en plein air writing gathered and pressed together with archival and documentary materials. My queer, white, chronically ill body, the pressure that rendered them one. The farther afield I've ranged, the more my poems have had to acknowledge the vast scale of the damage we've done to each other and to the earth. But far from shaking my faith in the precarious, such knowledge has only strengthened my commitment to defending and facilitating the fragile transit between the actual and the visionary that only poetry makes possible.
Thank you so much, Brian. Really excited and grateful that Joan Naviyuk Kane can join us tonight. Joan Naviyuk Kane was awarded the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship in 2018. And she currently teaches in the Department of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora at Tufts University, and in a low residency MFA program in creative writing at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Joan is also the author of several chapbooks and full-length collections, including most recently Another Bright Departure from Cutbank. Please join me in welcoming Joan Kane to tonight's program.
Thank you so much, and it's an honor to share time today with especially Ed and Brian, and thanks to Poets House. To pick up on a few of the things that Brian mentioned, I'm going to read a few poems, and I think these are related, sort of by way of fragment narrative, scale, and survival through precarious times. The first poem that I'll read is called Legend, and it references the 5 disasters that Inupiaq people of the Querec region are said to have survived, that we have survived, but according especially to one of our historians, William O'Culloch. And he wrote of 5 disasters. The first, a time of great seismic upheaval, followed by an eclipse. The second, a flood. The third, a year when summer never came, a year of 2 winters. The fourth, the flu pandemic of 1918. The fifth, this time of modernity that we inhabit. And the thing I think it's important to keep in mind about this poem, I'm writing through my namesake, Naviyuk, is the lyric I in this poem, and the Naviyuks who lived before her. Legend. Oh, and it's in 4 parts, and each of the 4 parts correspond to the first 4 disasters. The fifth I don't write about explicitly in this poem. Legend. 1. I would have been a girl bound in stone, quartz coarse, cracked, and whitening as bone. Os echoing away from twin calderas, but for a long string that drew me to the sea. A 16-strand sinnet lane on sand marks the rivers, on braiding, knotted, and plaiting their skeins toward the basin, where a red-throated loon, shot through the eye, yields his largest rib for an awl. At our junction, a bunch of feathers. I take a brittle weed in leaf, thumb shirt blade, gray. Our junction, a fumarole. When it smokes, I lose sight of the girl. It is nothing to know the rift and buckle, to witness the sun eclipsed for days on end, the bruised fields redden and freeze. 2. The sea then our garden, a film char of oil on water, a hiss of tides run up to that which was burning and has gone out. A slow erosion. It is one thing to give oneself to water. I wore down to a spur of myself. A bird with nowhere to land alighted on a femur, a terrible need. The land took a drink of the sea, mountain valleys soft as throats. She knew of submerged peaks recollected in an unheard song, seized in a lesser fever. The induced shore keeps still a drowned order. 3. Meant to have gone to famine in a season recurring from wind, it would not turn. Into a deep snow in sleep I shook again. If she could not beat the lightness from her clothes, it would become a layer that eddied around and mouth, myriad and everywhere. No animal stirs in the noiseless quick of a year of 2 winters, but marrow, gristle of a bloated fish, roots split and cashed, skin torn from the hull of a boat long withdrawn from water. 4. Hers a burial in damp sand by the springs. Through December willows green there. Alder bark reddens against late snow. Those dead too numerous, no loose entombments beneath scars of rock. Nothing roots in the oldest graves. Lichen lifts with a fingernail scrape. Leave belongings piled. The opaque white bead now unstrung. The unidentified fragment. Ivory ferrule. The small human figure carved of wood. The next poem I'll read from perhaps most explicitly references this time of the 5th disaster. It's called Headline News, and it's a found poem entirely compiled from headlines of the Nome Nugget newspaper. Nome is the city, the former gold rush town that is in the Querec region. And these are all headlines that were published between 1901 and 1976. Headline News. Eskimos have various thoughts about wolves. Father Tom says Eskimo life distorted by Chichakos. Foster wants to know who intimidated natives. Eskimo entertainment well received. Science confirms Eskimo belief on polar bear liver. Drunkenness named as major problem of natives. Health condition of natives unfavorable. Claims Eskimos in Alaska have been brainwashed. Natives may take polar bear for food. Alaska Eskimos said to have radioactivity. Both Eskimos and whites are subject to cold weather. Fake Eskimo art. Eskimo beauty queen. University of Alaska Museum adds Eskimo marionette. 3 Eskimos burst out of submerged plain and Selawik. Eskimos to get ice boxes. An entire Eskimo village moves from King Island to Nome. 200 Eskimos die of flu. Eskimos meet again. King Island Eskimos put on prehistoric wolf dance for MGM. Alaska Eskimo says she does not like US. Eskimo artist paints life the way it was in days gone by. Eskimo girl wants assailant's scalp. Native girl suicides on public street. Eskimos visualize hell as fine place to live. I'll read a short poem called Iridin. A coastline, a transitional place, bears evidence of others' dwelling. A house pit in the shape of a nest, another like a knife, a noose not lost in time. Ours a useful relationship, though not a tight one, for between us we knew there was something to lose. Fragrant in June heat and a field of confusion, nothing like metaphor. Moss campion, minute orchids, sweet, sweet vetch. And then I'll just read one last poem before having a chance to hear Ed, and then have a conversation. This is called The Incident Light, and in it there are names of the 3 other women who took me to King Island when I was able to go some 6 years ago. The Incident Light. I went for relief of the mind, to move into currents of worry. I did not know what the body held. I thought I would turn through broken ice and disappear the features of apprehension, of influence. If only I could betray the brute matter. If only the seas had not erased the facture, ladder, the easy reach. Instead, we sank into soft snow, 4 women ascending together the deep furrow worn by water, returning to water. Ayakadok, Uyuguluk, Yayuk, Naviyuk. I was startled, at once aware that the far road had fractured, done under by the fault we fought to bury. Land arises beyond a trouble of strong currents. The boat that bears us rises in them. With invisible stars we share blood. Those seas increased might scour and reflect. Those seas increased rephrase us.
Thank you so much, Joan. I look forward to convening with you and Brian after Ed's presentation. Ed Roberson has won an Academy of American Poets Fellowship, a PEN Volcker Award for Poetry, Shelley Memorial Award, and LA Times Book Award, among other honors. Ed is also the recent recipient of the 2020 Jackson Poetry Prize from Poets and Writers. Ed Roberson, I am so thrilled that you can join us in tonight's presentation.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying being here with Brian and Joan, and I'd just like to get started right quick so we can get to talking. I received a request to submit poems to an anthology called The End of the World. The request included a list of questions to which the submitted poems could respond. The first question was, in light of the recent climate changes, what has changed? And it was implying that there were changes in art, in your lifestyle, and et cetera. And my immediate response was, well, everything has changed. And that was the impetus for writing the current book that's coming out next year, and from which all of these poems are taken. The title of that book is called Ask What Has Changed. Meditating on nature was supposed to be peaceful and idyllic, a release from the chaotic. You look out the window and take a break from what you saw, or take a break in what you saw from what you were dealing with on the desk. But when you look out the window now, there's a possibility that what you see won't be there as permanently as you thought, as was supposed to be a relief. Meditating on nature still does do that. But today, that does not happen without some real hard hand-wringing, head-banging, and shamed thinking. And what I've done is I've taken the old tropes of poetry and tried to change them, make them new, being able to report what's happening now in ways that are familiar to us. So I'd like to read this sequence of poems. In these poems, mountains, peaks, and wings as uplifts and horizons, they act differently than they used to act in the poems that we're used to reading and writing. So I'd like to read Ask What Has Changed. Even staring out the window has changed. The private peak above it all brought down with the erosion of the poise between the viewable and the mused unseen. Dissolution, so nearly changeless as not to appear, is shifting the sands inside from what we watched. No more the steady stage, the self-dramatic days played out on outside. The silent portent now a loud alert to things changing, the light, a darkness. Not the normal individual mortality, but as if the epical heartbeat of larger elements, the seas, the air, had mutated, become chimera, grown wing, and routed ancestral time. Even staring out the window, the timeless is gone. We see coming in the daily migration of the local geese to the lake at evening, the cities pull up and move in unlike consternation towards and away from the water that has been so calming to gaze out on, to live by, easy to not live according to. And now that seas are adding themselves into the land, horizons look ominously larger. The arriving out of them faster and clearer. Now we see the view is turned on us to frame human agency, become transparent, light as air, before the picture blackens, as a consequence of our seeing too much of it as only for us to use and then use up. The eye is not filled with seeing, with only seeing, but with understanding the sight. The question that then comes from that it is, where do we stand in these things we've seen? I try to take the old imageries with the new technologies. For instance, speed photography revealed the bubble that jumped up out of the ripples caused by a drop of water into water. That bubble is not yet named. It's called a bubble, or called a backjet, or called a levitating globule by the physicists. All the newness of seeing that's still yet not fully named. One of the levitating globules is the Earth seen from space. It's called the blue pearl, but it is maybe the backjet of the liftoff. But anyhow, that's the main image of this next poem, What is Called Troubling. What is called troubling? The water. What has changed from glancing out at the weather to the unrevealed information held in the pointilless flux of water raising something in me, a backjet, a levitating globule, is a deepening in everything I want to know. The larger networks of answers ripple, flowering, the trees, the loam they're loamed from, the earth that pops, free of its drop, as itself a moment for a glimpse before resolution back into the pool. The idea being that if Our reality is holographic. That bubble, as if blanket tossed up above the ripple circle, is us, where on it I am following these images, the same way to hear, resolved into a juggling fool, whose water oranges round up one morning come off the horizon of the lake as sun. That brings us to the question of, well, we need to look at ourselves. And this next poem is called Lux. Lux. You should wonder what the necklace of your fingernails and teeth look like worn, for instance, by the bear that ate you, more likely than not very unpolished, or a cave wall hanging, too skinny, rug even, peeled open for the floor, more like belts and wallets, were bears enamored of accessories, what with the sun-bleached tip of each hair to flop back and forth through their fur. An iridescence, wind and wind-like through a field. How redundant you are in addition, useless. If aesthetics have no nutrient, but then you might not even have a beauty to collect, have anything to do with anything except the way you see. You should wonder what a necklace of your teeth would bring among the animal trade, your ears, war criminals among your own, were known to string like cowries of victory, their genitals in jars on desk your conquerors kept to terrify their sharecroppers. But animals don't keep containers outside their bodies as their mess. You should wonder what your bones drape like in their stomachs, what your eyeballs light in their digestive fireplaces, what your prune liver makes them shit like jewels delivered to the earth. Shit like jewels delivered to the earth. They're gifts for fertilizing the dirt. You should wonder whether your ideas of beauty are as generous. This makes us look then at our relation to the animals and our respect for their forms. This next poem is called Loco Movere. It's about pronghorn antelopes. Antelope don't look like they put their feet down on anything. They seem to pick at the ground, to pinch themselves off the ground up into air, whereas horses seem to dig at, to scoop away the distance. The wheel almost never lifts, to miss a measure, but that song has no organic round of evolution it has won, unless in a long lost sea, or that roll of the foot flat part, not whole of the wheel, are our own, a broken tape on the ground. Is this why we sing through these death marches, measure, calling out to each other to keep up, to not get picked off, touch the fellow footsteps as all that's sound of the earth, and to know where to go, silent, faceless, when we steal away and run on the wing. And we contemplate the loss of all of this. So the next poem is called Sand, taking the traditional image of sand. The sand sticks to me as though it had fallen as snow. The silica's wet glitter dry. I'm coated with a line as if I had lain in water, floating like the boats that lie about what they're on in the glare, sky and water interchanging their light. I am uncertain what luminary bears this sandcastle illusion upright. This beach wasn't here before the hurricane. Houses that were here aren't here either. The glaciation of this earth change planes away the known into the thin curl we feared it was, something we brush off that could be brushed off. Morello's Venice is an actual event. My doctor. Startled to hear the doctor say this would be the last time he would see it. A person used to keeping things alive, talking terminus. Even more startled when he returned to hear him say it wasn't there. There were terrible rains, bookings canceled. When late he arrived, everything was gone. His wife had a cold. They bundled together in blankets. He refilled my prescription to restore my soul. A way of seeing as deep as the sea is, a drunkenness of seeing when the wine talks. The walls wash away, we see the colors of the changes through the consequential meaning we thought was the eye of God. It was just the ending, the surface disappearing, then blank, the transparency to say what we see. Venice without canals is only water. His song is the wine dark sea. Her eyes are the wine dark sea. When they wash ashore, out of their mouths spills the wine dark sea. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. Thank you, Joan, and thank you, Brian. Much to cover. The headline for tonight's Poetry Coalition event is taken from the Audre Lorde poem New Year's Day, and the line is, "I am deliberate and afraid of nothing." I see this line of Audre Lorde's as resonant in each of your own poetries and your own praxis. Each of you write experimental poetry. Each of you are also engaged in a profound sense of civic duty to history, to culture, to community, to identities. And I, can only imagine in a super late capitalist world that we move through, and poetry is not immune to this. I am thinking about a poetry that embraces complete incompleteness, breach lyrics, and certainly a poetry that is invested in what is troubling. Would each of you talk about what the stakes have been for you in this path, this journey in poetry that has brought you to this moment? And maybe we could start with Ed.
When you say stakes, what comes to mind is what you're going to put on the table, and whether you think it's a game, whether you think that something is going to move enough to have you lose things. I think I regarded poetry as the best way for me to do that, because I wasn't an outgoing person, a leader type personality, but I did sit at home and read a lot, and especially I watched a lot of what I saw going on. But then the stakes were that once you see that, you're not afraid to put that on the table. Poetry was the way for me to be clear about those field observations that I was making, to work out those field observations, to make sure that they were as accurate as I thought, put them on the table and just get my ass kicked for what I said. I think we're at that point now where we just have to be honest and lay out on the table in our ways, images, sonnets, personal histories, laying that stuff out on the table to let people see what that means. If we lose this, if we lose the Portage Glacier. I saw the Portage Glacier in 1960 when I worked in Alaska. One of the poems in I think of the last book, was this horrible image I saw of Portage Glacier that had retreated, like you had to walk back to it. So putting that stuff on the table, just challenging people to see it, and giving people's ways to see it. That's my responsibility. You're asking the stakes. I'm laying the shit out there. Yeah, I don't care. I'm an old man. I'll say whatever the fuck I want.
How about you, Joan?
Well, I think the image of Portage Glacier is on my mind because Ed, when my sons and I, one of the things we did last spring before we moved to Massachusetts and leaving Alaska is one day it sort of was on the news that part of Portage Glacier, an iceberg had broken off and floated across what's Portage Lake now and was visible to people. And my sons and my father and I drove all the way down to Portage Glacier from Anchorage and made sure to look at it and see it, to observe it. It was on a weekend day, but we did this, and it wasn't just a sense of this voyeurism of climate change and the rapidity of it. It wasn't just a chance to get out with my sons and my father, but it was also the sense I had in leaving Alaska that the image and the extent to which image, memory, language, that I would be able to make something of this, to keep something of a place that I was leaving, and that my children would as well, through the experience of having this connection to this place and a part of a glacier that was never visible during their lifetimes, and how different that was from the childhood that I knew. But I think for me, the stakes are that poetry is a way to engage with how things change and how the human consciousness and how through listening or reading or writing a poem, how we can observe those changes happening and taking place. It's not about documenting things necessarily, but establishing a relationship to things. And for me, poetry has always been a way to connect with something other than myself, a sense of looking for some way to enlarge my perspective or inform it with things that are beyond that which I know. And I think that's one way. I started with a poem Legend today because I remember writing that, living in New York City, having moved there 3 weeks before 9/11, and finding that my words were inadequate, and that I needed not only to turn to the words of my community, my ancestors, but the words of people who survived very many things, and whose words survived them. And I think that's part of what's at stake for me as a poet, and as a teacher and as a mother.
I am really humbled by those very lucid answers that are also very beautiful. I started writing when HIV was still a death sentence, and with a collective sense of engagement with identity politics and also kind of resistance. And though my work, changed a lot after moving to the Bay Area and becoming exposed to a lot of new aesthetic vocabularies and new aesthetic communities and political communities, I think that in some ways, my work has kind of returned to that collective sense of urgency by reckoning and coming to really understand the scale of the crisis that we're in. And also by being able to admit, I think for me, a kind of love of the things of creation of this earth that I think for a long time I didn't have a vocabulary for, because actually of the identity poetics I had been kind of introduced to as a young writer. And so I think for me that, I entered into writing through an extreme sense of collective urgency and crisis and sorrow and trauma. And in some ways, like, I don't think I think my work has turned away from that at certain points, in order to explore myself and my own sense of aesthetics and aesthetic possibility. But I think that early training, and that emergence into a collective crisis, in some ways kind of prepared me to return to that sense, with a renewed, I guess, sense of urgency. So weirdly, I think shit don't change, but we change. And I find myself, heartened, by the work that I see others doing, and by the response, the vibrant response of other poets. I think that's why my talk focused a bit more on other people than on myself, because I just draw so much strength and inspiration from the poets around me who have a commitment to language that our culture constantly undermines, and denigrates. And I feel like more than ever, I think I feel just so moved by the kinds of commitment that I see in poets like Ed and Joan, and just humbled by it. And I hope that my own work can rise to that level of commitment and belief and urgency, that are really necessary right now.
And this leads me to my next point, which is not really a point, it's a question. Pedagogy. Audre Lorde is as famous a teacher as she is a poet and an activist. And the three of you are experienced teachers. And what has it been like for you to be teaching poetry in these junctures in your lives as poets? Certainly in this particular juncture, we're all trying to figure out.
I love teaching. It feels as much a part of my vocation as writing, honestly. And I feel I am the kind of writer who gets a lot from dialogue, from classroom, from introducing writers like Joan and Ed to my students, and facilitating a space to hold that work. But I feel like all of that is actually, to kind of go back to one of your insights, Paolo, is like, I really want to leave my students with an expanded sense of the real. And to me, that's both really political and a sense of care, for them, but also for the real itself. That if I make my students responsible for that expanded sense of the real, that classrooms, or I should say, the classrooms that I grew up in did not include a sense of the ecological, did not include a sense of identity politics, did not include a sense of solidarity, of a kind of critical mindedness about the historical and political contexts in which we write. I think that is incredibly important as a teacher, and that we craft things, we make shit and write in that context continually. And so for me, in some ways, a moment like this one, like the pandemic, it became my responsibility to, open up the classroom to hold the current events. I happened to be teaching an eco-poetics and eco-criticism class, so I was able to do a lesson on zoonotic pandemics and talk about how this was another kind of iteration of the Anthropocene and global connection and globalization and trade routes, et cetera, and mobility. And so, I feel incredibly lucky and grateful to be able to teach, but also to continually interact with students who push me in new directions and expand my own sense of the real. And I think that happens through dialogue and through community. So I feel I felt so grateful during lockdown to be able to talk to my students and to engage in little experiments in virtual community, and to be able to kind of, hold each other in a relation during this moment. So, which was very difficult and hit all of my students very differently, so yeah, that's my answer to you.
One of the things that I am, for my answer, one of the things that I wanted to say was that to hear Brian talk about how where he started. So he started out in identity poetry, identity politics, and the poetry enlarged his world so much. So I well, if you get a picture of us from space, the problems of identity are sort of answered for you right away. I mean, it's us. There's only one identity. I mean, it's that little round ball out there. That's us. That's your identity. That's it. No fucking around. That's it. There's no place else to go. At least with what you have. But what that does is that doesn't diminish you at all. What that does is really enlarge your sense of what you see in other people, in other parts of the world, and other people's reactions. That this is a larger, this is the larger us, these other things that you see. So I think people look at this, things that come up with this climate change and this new focus in ecology as a big problem, a big trouble, but it's a great gift at this point to be able to see what we've been missing. And like Joan saying, there she was in Alaska and she's leaving it and she gets to see Portage Glacier. And she's right. That'll go with you forever. You'll carry that, and it'll show up in a poem that somebody will read a century from now, and know that when you leave home and along the way, as you're going past Anchorage, past the glacier, you stop and you take a look, and then you head for Toke Junction, and then down the Alaska Highway, and it's all gone. But you got those things with you. They're there and they'll show up. They'll continue to show up. And that enlarging of yourself is what the enlarged person will put on a page and enlarge the world. That's the way I look at it. That's the way I look at it. This is not a bad moment. This is really a good moment. But we've got to see it. This is really a good moment. This really should enlarge people's idea about not just my identity, but a lot of the identities that eventually come down to us, animals too. That's the way I look at it. It's just a much enlarging thing is what she's talking about.
I think some of what I've experienced in the last 10 weeks in particular as a teacher, both college students and graduate students, is when I hear my students say to me that it's really challenging to focus on coursework right now, and whether it's whether they're learning to write or studying Indigenous issues, Indigenous literature and culture. I think one of the things that I'm learning, I continue to learn as a teacher and try to respond to my students with, is that some of these things were difficult before the last couple of months and will continue to be difficult, but how to look at what we invest our time and energy in, not just as Brian had mentioned, community, and as Ed has mentioned, perspective and a sense of collective identity, but I think, about the ways in which through teaching and reading and discussing literature and working from a position of craft and intentionality, how poetry can help people survive and how it has helped people survive. And I think that's, as a teacher, what I've experienced, both with my students and also with my children, who, as with many parents and many single parents, looking at how and what our children are learning, and as they ask us the questions about why they're learning these things, why they're spending time the way they are now, I think that's something that I'm continuing to be attentive to.
Ed, it just makes me think about each time that you would read a poem, you would smile, you would break out in a smile after reading a poem in your earlier talk, but then also in the previous video we did for you for Poets House Presents. And that really does underscore your message. But I hear from you, Joan, and I hear from you, Brian, and I hear from you, Ed, this tremendous sense of possibility in this moment that we're in. And I wouldn't necessarily call it optimism, but perhaps a little bit of optimism and hope in that this moment opens up other portals of engagement, an opening. And I am just really excited to hear this as a fan of your work, as a student of your work, as a parent myself, Joan, of 2 young daughters, who wakes up every day really trying to summon everything that I can to fight back that despair. But as ever, this conversation is an initial one with the three of you. I am incredibly grateful that the three of you could be here tonight and present tonight. I just wanted to tell our viewers that Brian, Joan, and Ed are also taking part in our Poets House Presents series of readings. Do look out for these programs. Would you let us know where you are streaming from?
I'm from Chicago. I'm on the south side of Chicago, Bronzeville.
Charlottesville, Virginia.
I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
I am in Sunnyside, Queens. I want to thank Ed, Brian, and Joan, and all our viewers tonight for being a part of this event. Wishing you kindness, love, generosity, and compassion. I'll see you soon.
If you've enjoyed these programs, please consider giving a contribution to Poets House. For more than 30 years, they've kept the door wide open to everyone for the joy of poetry. Recently, they have temporarily had to shut the door and are reeling from the financial implications. Please give, even a small donation if you can. Thank you.